Hello, and welcome to Unit 5 of Purdue's Technology, Innovation, and the Civil War course. I'm Dr. Nick Sambaluk. The Civil War's first major battle, First Bull Run or First Manassas, proved bloodier than anticipated. Rebuilding the Army of the Potomac under Major General George McClellan took longer than anticipated. And in the second year of the war, the Battle of Shiloh in the Western Theater indicated that the troops and the commanders were still less ready than had been assumed. This week, in our course, we're focusing on how the combating countries sustained their war efforts. Wars consume people and material, and logistics are crucial for sustaining a war effort. The United States held an important logistical advantage in the form of an innovation that was already 4 decades old. Secretary of War John Calhoun had reorganized the Army and created a new system of staff bureaus to support it. The Subsistence Department procured food. The Ordnance Department supplied weapons. And the Quartermaster's Department addressed almost all other logistical issues that the Army might encounter. From the horse, to the saddle, to the horseshoe, to the uniform, tool, wagon, or tent, the quartermaster was to fulfill nearly all supply needs. Heading the quartermaster's department for 4 decades was Brigadier General Thomas Jessup. Jessup ensured a professionalism and an independence for his bureau that helped ensure that this vital but easily overlooked part of the Army did not fall prey to political sweetheart deals. That is significant given that we're talking about the spoils system era of government. We'll return to that in a moment. You may recall that shortly before secession, in Gallagher's chapter of the West Point History of the Civil War, it mentions that Secretary of War John B. Floyd in 1860 was a prominent Southern sympathizer. He transferred artillery from one government arsenal in Pennsylvania to another government arsenal in Texas. And he did this for a very specific underlying reason. Floyd secretly wanted to help Confederates capture the guns if war erupted. The Civil War has not yet started, but already Secretary of War Floyd, a standing U.S. Secretary of War, the equivalent to today's Secretary of Defense, is reallocating weapons so that they can be seized by the rebels if a rebellion occurs. Staggering kind of plan. Floyd was, however, unable to coerce or to manipulate the Quartermaster's Department. When Jessup died in office in June 1860, his first replacement was a man named Brigadier General Joseph E. Johnston, before he, like Floyd, abandoned the Union to become a Confederate officer. Next came Brigadier General Montgomery Meigs, who served for the duration of the war. Meigs, carrying forward Jessup's legacy of independence and competence, resisted wartime pressures from both Lincoln's first Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, and President Lincoln himself to buy mules from a contractor friendly to Cameron. Meigs ensured that the Union armies received the supplies they needed to the best degree possible, given the transportation of the day and the scale of the conflict. Remember, this is an absolutely enormous conflict. Meigs guarded against nepotism in contracting, and the Quartermaster's Department was run by typically regular Army professionals who did not put their own politics before the country's national policy. That's very significant. Uh, Meigs himself, personally, in the 1860 election, had been a Northern Democrat. He had voted for Stephen Douglas. Nonetheless, he made sure that his own political druthers did not affect the way that he did his job, despite the fact he was serving a Republican president. This is rather significant for the day and age. Remember, the so-called spoils system, which we mentioned a moment ago, had been introduced by Andrew Jackson in the 1820s, and it had set a pattern of sweetheart deals and nepotism in official posts. This was standard procedure. This was standard federal practice for about 50 years. It was not altered in the federal government until the introduction of standardized sort of meritocratic systems under the Pendleton Act in 1883. So this goes on for 50 years, including the Civil War era. But the integrity of the quartermaster represented a significant and an early innovation, helping strengthen the effectiveness of the Union war effort in a crucial area. Weapons and ammunition were among the only items whose provision was not the responsibility of the quartermasters. Having the right ammunition matters in war. Effective projectiles need to be assembled, paid for, transported to the front line, issued to the soldiers before they can actually ever be used in combat. A lot has to be done. We have some examples of Civil War artillery ordnance to discuss. First, we see solid shot and canister and a timed shell. I want to discuss the difference and the significance between the 6-pounder and 12-pounder artillery. The famous flying artillery of the Mexican War had been very effective in the 1840s. American gunners were able to position their guns and fire their cannon, which were rather nimble artillery pieces. The carriages were not too heavy. The guns themselves were quite light, particularly relative to Mexican Army artillery, which was heavy, ponderous, and antiquated. A lot of the Mexican artillery pieces were a couple hundred years old. And so they were very, very thick bronze weapons, couldn't be moved very, very easily on a battlefield. And American gunners were able to take advantage of this by shifting and moving their cannon to advantageous spots, and then firing quickly, and then moving to another advantageous spot as the dynamic flux of a battle occurred. Different positions became better for as artillery platforms, and American gunners were able to reply to these changing needs because their guns were light. This was crucial in the 1840s, and it helped the Americans win the Mexican-American War. But by the 1860s, the 6-pounder had been overtaken by better artillery rivals, particularly the 12-pounder Napoleon gun, a smooth-bore, muzzle-loading cannon very similar to the 6-pounder, but firing an artillery round twice as heavy. The Confederacy nonetheless continued to use 6-pounders as well as 12-pounders because its leading ironworks in Richmond, Tredegar, was too busy to replace the CSA's artillery overnight. If there's anything that is made of iron that the Confederacy needs, it's almost certainly going to have to come from the Tredegar Ironworks of Richmond. If it's a locomotive or an artillery piece or an iron rail for the railroads or an ironclad, it's all going to have to come from the Tredegar Ironworks of Richmond. So the Confederacy continued to fight with the 6-pounders that had captured early in the war, thanks to Floyd, as well as whatever 12-pounder artillery or other assortment of domestic or foreign imported guns it could manage to muster. A frustrated General Lee, in the middle of the war, pleaded with the Confederate President Jefferson Davis to melt down the 6-pounder guns so that they could be recast into more effective, more worthwhile 12-pounder Napoleons. Incidentally, the Napoleon gun gets its name from Napoleon III. He's a descendant, a relative of Napoleon Bonaparte, but it's not named after Bonaparte himself. The 12-pounder's ammo is similar in design to the predecessor, to the 6-pounder's ammunition. Obviously, it's bigger. It's not quite twice as big, but it is twice as heavy. Solid shot is intended to punch into targets and to break them, or to bounce in front of and through infantry formations. That is the role of solid shot, to bounce through or hit a target. If it's an infantry target, it's me bouncing through to tearing off legs and arms and heads as it travels through the ranks of probably a massed infantry formation. Canister and case ammunition are similar ammunition types. They are cylindrical metal containers filled with metal shards that spread out, effectively transforming a cannon into something like a giant shotgun with a 300-yard range. Obviously, as with buck and ball ammunition in a small arm, canister and case ammunition are really weapons that are ammunition systems that are confined to the smoothbore sort of genre. You don't want to have a rifled gun that is being scratched out by ammunition flying randomly down the barrel and tearing gouges in the inside of the barrel. So canister and case are both ammunitions that are pretty well suited to a smoothbore gun like the Napoleon 12-pounder. Also very well suited to relatively close-in targets. Infantry formations, as they are approaching within rifle musket range of a gunnery position, might find themselves under canister or case fire. Both sides also used fuse shells with a timer, which was intended to cause the shell to burst over a target and rain metal shards onto that target, such as infantry in the open. There were several variants to fuse shells. For some, a notch was turned to the correct position to count down toward a detonation of the shell at a particular time, like an egg timer. Alternatively, other types used a cord that the artillerists would trim to the correct length, and the fuse would burn its way toward the shell. The shell would then explode and shower fragments of iron onto the enemy. In reality, fuse shells of the Civil War did not really live up to the hopes or the hype. If a timer ran more slowly than expected, the shell flew harmlessly over the target and past it. If ranges were misestimated, the same thing might occur. If the timer ran fast, a shell might explode over the heads of friendly infantry and shower shards onto them. And then additionally, a lot of shells were duds and didn't explode at all. Even when shells did explode, they were unperforated on the interior, and their thick iron walls tended to make the shell break into a few large fragments that didn't travel very far. This was lethal for people who were very near the exploding shell, but the lethal radius was actually very limited, especially during the Civil War era. In learning about innovation and the sustaining of a war effort, I'd like to invite you to think about these issues and discuss them on the discussion board. Any country involved in a war would rather win than lose. So what other factors, in addition to the effectiveness in a war itself, in combat and making a war become victorious, impact decision-making about how to sustain a war effort? Since contemporary projectiles weren't more reliable, why do you think Civil War armies still chose to use an array of different kinds of ammunition for their guns during the conflict? Next time, we'll be looking at entrenchment innovations and exotic weapons on land. See you next time.